Our next section, we did spinal cord. Now we're going to do the brain, which is the next part of the central nervous system. It has a lot of, obviously, complex parts. You could spend an entire year doing nothing but studying the brain and still never cover all the details to it because it's so complicated. So we're going to cover the basics. So the brain has 4 basic parts. And all mammalian brains have these 4 parts. Obviously, humans and a few other types of mammals have very complicated certain regions that are more complicated than other types of mammals or other types of vertebrate animals. So the cerebrum being the first one, it's the largest portion of our brain. It's the portion that we do most of our thinking and we think of as, well, how we think ourselves, be able to do tasks that other animals can't, because a lot of other animals don't have large cerebrums. The diencephalon, or the sort of next section, are little sort of double parts of the brain. The brain stem, or the base of the brain, and then the cerebellum, or the little brain. Some people sometimes say the forebrain, midbrain, hindbrain, and then the cerebellum, because in other animals, they're in a straight line as opposed to the way ours is kind of curved. The meninges, again, are the same as the spinal cord. It's continuous. There's no difference between the two of them. They're basically connected. I don't want any gaps that allow cerebrospinal fluid to leak out. So I look at it from this perspective. I can see this very large cerebrum here as a cut through. I have my diencephalon right here. I have my brain stem, and then I have the cerebellum right back here, the little brain. So we'll start with the cerebrum, or the higher brain, or the forebrain, the one that we typically talk about. It's where we talk about it being the largest portion. It's also where we have a lot of the different tasks that we can do, such as thinking, rational thinking, logic, math, English. All the skills we do for school are really done here. So the structure of the cerebrum. It has 2 hemispheres, a right and a left hemisphere. You may have talked about people being dominated by one or the other. And for some tasks, we tend to favor one or the other, but we really use both of them all the time. It's kind of a myth that we don't use both of them. Both of them are used. It's just sometimes one of them tends to have more control over a task than another group. So some people are more right side than left side for certain tasks. The corpus callosum is the connection point between the 2 of them. So it's going to connect both of them. It's basically a little bit of white matter that helps connect and send signals back and forth. It's highly important for the 2 of them to be able to communicate. There are situations where people have things like alien hand syndrome, where basically this got connected, or got disconnected. You broke the corpus callosum. So now the 2 parts can't connect. So the left side's doing something while the right side's also doing something, and they're not really talking, they're both acting independently. So the person's trying to use one side of the brain for conscious thought, and they think they're doing this while the other side of the body is doing something totally different because the brain's being subconsciously controlled by the other half. This is a rare phenomenon, it does happen, but that helps us understand how the 2 brain hemispheres work together because of that. The convolutions are the little folds. One thing people talk about when they see a brain is it's got really a lot of wrinkles to it. Those wrinkles are actually important because it gives us more surface area to do complicated tasks. Because if it was just flat and smooth, it'd be a limited amount of surface area. By having more surface area means I have more space to do things. So it's the wrinkled folds of the cerebrum. We also call them the gyri, because they have gyrations, or up and down motions. The sulcus is the term for a shallow groove, so little small grooves between the folds. But there are also very large sort of ones that are much bigger than a simple little shallow groove. Those are called a fissure. And they're usually just used to break up large regions of the cerebrum or separate the hemispheres themselves. So for example, a longitudinal fissure is the one that divides it into the right and left hemisphere. It goes right down the center of our brain. Right below that nice little suture we have there, it sits right there below it. So it separates the 2 of them into 2 halves. The transverse fissure separates the cerebrum from the cerebellum. There's actually a gap there, held together by little bits of connective tissue. If there's enough pressure to it, it will separate and allow things to come through and get in there and cause damage. That's a problem. We don't want that to happen, so things are typically very well tightly bound together. This shows you a cut through the sides here where they've actually divided through that longitudinal fissure all the way down so you can see the brain parts. Here's that transverse fissure right back here, separating the 2 of these, goes all the way up there. One of the key things about the cerebrum is the lobes. It's divided up into lobes, and those lobes are the functional areas. So each one has different tasks, roughly. I say roughly because every person's brain is slightly different. One person's ability to do math is maybe in this little spot, and the other person's ability is to do it right over here. Nearby, similar region, but not exactly the same, because as you learn, your brain mapped it into different regions. That's why it's so difficult for brain surgeons to work on a brain. They actually have to map the brain. You may have seen videos on the internet where somebody is knocked unconscious, they cut open the skull, they wake them back up in sort of a brace, and they ask them questions while they touch their brain to see where different parts do different tasks. And then they label those so they don't cut out your ability to talk or learn numbers and things like that. It's divided up into lobes. It should sound familiar. Frontal, parietal, occipital, temporal. These are the bones. They're named for the bones that are sitting on top of the regions of the brain. The central sulcus, because you have to have divisions between these regions, separates the frontal and parietal lobes. So it's going to separate those two. That should be familiar because it's very similar to what the coronal suture is on the bones. Lateral sulcus would be the one that separates the frontal from temporal bones. So it's going to separate the frontal temporal kind of along here where the sagittal suture goes. And in the cerebral cortex is the region on the outside. It's a very small, thin layer of gray matter. It's about 2 millimeters thick on average for most people. This is where we do what we think of as thinking. This is where all those things of our skills we're using right now to listen and do this video and to talk about things is being done right here. White matter is going to be lying underneath it. So it's the flip of the spinal cord where the gray matter is on the inside, white matter is on the outside. Now I flipped it. The downside is my area of very active neurons is on the outside, which means it's more able to be damaged. That's why you see things like concussions, because that got pushed up against the skull and caused damage to the cerebral cortex, causing those kinds of cognitive impairments that we see with things like CTE and with just regular concussions in general. Our brain is not multicolored, but this shows you some of the general regions of how it's set up, where you've got things like the temporal lobe, the occipital lobe, the parietal lobe, the frontal lobe, and you can see where it's got different tasks associated with different areas listed on here, like understanding speech and words, right, roughly in this area here. So those areas are kind of set up that way. We have to kind of map that. They're in generalities. Our motor areas, ones control our motor functions. They're mainly the frontal lobes. Your front of your brain is basically controlling your ability to have conscious thought and to consciously move your hands, to do all those tasks, things like that. It contains what we call pyramidal cells. They're not really pyramids. They kind of have roughly a mounded shape, so they're called that. They're also called the upper motor neurons. There's also a lower set of those that are called the lower motor neurons. They're transmitting and sort of like redirecting signals back and forth. So things come in here and they go to these spots, and these things get basically shifted to the right portion of the body where it's supposed to go. Sometimes those get messed up and it goes to the wrong spot. So signals are going to go down this way. They're going to start on the cerebral cortex, they're going to go down, and they're going to, in the brainstem, cross over, because this side of my brain controls this side of my body, and vice versa. The signals switch over. Why it actually is, we're not 100% certain, but it does that. Then in the spinal cord and in lower motor neurons, you're able to transmit signals through lower motor neurons all the way down to where they go in the body to do what you're supposed to do. So there's lots of little steps in here in order to make these signals go from here all the way down here, and it still happens in fractions of a second. One of the key areas that is a motor area is the Broca's areas. That's your motor speech areas. It allows you to do what I'm doing right now, talk. It controls those muscles that help us to speak. So it's going to have some big impacts on how that works. And when that has an impairment in there, it can cause all kinds of different issues. The frontal eye field, which helps us to visually look for things, focus in, identify, move, track movement, things like that, is going to be located in the frontal part of the brain as well, usually kind of up towards the front here on the sides. It's usually generally a small enough area. You may have heard of stories like the math genius who could do math in his head like that and do simple or really complicated problems quickly. They discovered his math area was overlapping his frontal eye vision, so basically he was doing math as quick as he saw it. So because his muscles were able to do that with his brain and his calculation skills all connected. Sometimes that happens. Sometimes it's a weird oddity of the way our bodies work. So again, frontal eye field's up here, our Broca's area is right over here in this little small purple spot. The sensory areas. Well, skin sensations, like touch on our skin, are located right along the anterior portion, the front to top portion of the parietal lobes, along the central sulcus. So near where we see things like, our motor functions for our body. Vision is located in occipital lobes. That's why if you get smacked in the back of the head really hard, they say you see stars, because sometimes it's going to interrupt the ability of vision to be received, and you get faulty signals. Hearing is in the temporal lobes. Makes sense. It's right next to the temporal lobe, and the ears. So it's a very short little traveling distance. Taste is at the junction of the central and lateral sulcus right towards the edge over here. Smell is kind of a weird one because it's not on the outside. Smell actually goes deeper on the inside. Little bits of gray matter are located on the inside. It's a very primitive sense. And since some of the other earlier animals don't have some of these other senses as in great detail, they have sense of smell. And that actually is a very primitive, built-in, small little one. So again, I can see all these things up here. I can see the central sulcus right up here. I can see sensory areas for all my skin, all that kind of stuff like that. I can get the visual area right back here, you see in the back, all that kind of stuff like that. Auditory areas coming over here on the sides. You'll notice a lot of these overlap. That's how we get these general pictures of what's going on in the world.